The United States recently issued new sanctions against Zimbabwe, and I think most people's reaction is going to be, why the hell are we going after Zimbabwe? When you think about the countries the US is punishing with financial and trade sanctions, most people know of Iran or Cuba or Venezuela. But the United States has actually maintained a severe sanctions regime against Zimbabwe for the last 21 years, and it hardly gets mentioned in the media. And the worst part is, these sanctions were essentially put in place because Zimbabweans took back their own land from European settlers. Here's what you need to know. Zimbabwe, like many other regions of Africa, was colonized by European powers in the late 19th century. The various European powers met at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and divided up the continent, deciding which powers would control which regions. The British Empire, one of the strongest European powers at the time, decided that it would take massive portions of northern and southern Africa, including Zimbabwe. The man responsible for overseeing Britain's conquest of southern Africa was Cecil Rhodes, an arch racist and an unabashed defender of European imperialism and colonization. To give you an idea of how he thought, here's Rhodes in his own words. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses. And by the way, this is the same Rhodes that the Rhodes Scholarship is named after. In 1890, Rhodes led the British conquest of Zimbabwe and named it Rhodesia, after himself. A little over a decade later, the British controlled 3/4 of the country and made the indigenous Africans tenants on their own land, forcing them to pay fees and taxes to live on the land that rightfully belonged to them. Taking the land and all the valuable resources that came with it made the British settlers incredibly wealthy. On the flip side, having their land taken, black Rhodesians were forced to become wage laborers, working for the white landowners for barely enough to scrape by. The typical white neighborhood in Rhodesia had big luxury houses with big lawns and gardens, while most black people lived in cramped substandard housing. The only black people that lived in the nicer white neighborhoods were domestic workers, who took care of household labor and landscaping. They lived on their white employers' properties. The white monopoly over the land also gave whites a monopoly over the Rhodesian political system, which was dominated by whites despite the fact that the country was overwhelmingly black. To give you an idea of how skewed Rhodesia's political system was, in 1976, Rhodesia's black population was over 6 million, while the white population was only 250,000. Despite this, of the 6 million black people in Rhodesia, only 9,000 had the right to vote. This allowed white voters to elect 50 members of Rhodesia's parliament, whereas black voters only elected 16. Many in the United States understandably compared this to Jim Crow. Rhodesia's Prime Minister Ian Smith famously declared that he would never support black majority rule in the country, not in 1,000 years. The government was so committed to white minority rule that it would go on to draft every white man under the age of 38 into the military to fight a bloody war against black liberation fighters instead of making concessions to them. However, no amount of conscription can change the reality that this country did not, nor did it ever, belong to white people. They had merely occupied it. Recognizing that a white-led government in southern Africa would never last, in 1979, the Rhodesian government pressured the black freedom fighters into an agreement called the Lancaster House Agreement in an attempt to salvage some semblance of white power. The Lancaster House Agreement reserved parliamentary seats for whites, and instead of simply returning the stolen land back to its rightful owners, set up a market-based system called willing buyer, willing seller, where the government of the newly named Zimbabwe would have to buy their own land back from the white farmers using foreign currency. The value of the land would be determined by foreign real estate companies owned by these very same white farmers. Zimbabwe's newly elected president, Robert Mugabe, who had become a preeminent leader in the liberation struggle, tried to adhere to the Lancaster Agreement, but progress was slow. For most of this time, Western powers praised Mugabe as a kind of moderate, reasonable force. But even a decade after the end of the war and the fall of Rhodesia, whites still controlled the vast majority of the land. In 1998, it was estimated that 95% of the economy was owned by white people or foreign investors. Many veterans of the Liberation War were getting tired of waiting. After all, they had risked their lives for this land, and they were beginning to feel that all of that fighting had been for nothing. The war veterans started occupying the white farms on their own accord, and Mugabe then gave the veterans the government's backing. In direct response to this policy, the US Congress passed its first set of sanctions against Zimbabwe, freezing Zimbabwe's credit. For the next 21 years, the US, EU, and Canada would go on to repeatedly punish Zimbabwe for what amounts to taking back its own land. The latest round of sanctions is just a continuation of this neocolonial history. After a 2-week trip in Zimbabwe, the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions wrote a report calling on the various countries sanctioning Zimbabwe to lift these measures because of the devastating effect they had on the country. The report describes a country unable to develop because the financial sanctions against it prevent it from accessing credit and trading on the international market. The report states that financial restrictions prevent Zimbabwe from importing new technology and spare parts, which has rendered much of its health, transportation, energy, water, and other critical infrastructure obsolete. These policies have created a crisis of food insecurity, with over 7 million Zimbabweans going hungry in a country of 15 million, as well as a crisis of disease due to Zimbabwe's inability to import parts needed to clean its own water. The sanctions against Zimbabwe's state-owned companies have deprived Zimbabwe of revenue that it needs to fund essential services. In total, it's estimated that sanctions have deprived Zimbabwe of over $100 billion worth of aid and loans since 2001, a sum 4 times greater than the country's GDP. The Western media still demonizes Zimbabwe as a country that's apparently racist against whites for having expropriated the land they stole. They mock Zimbabwe and the land reform, saying that it's what made Zimbabwe poor, completely leaving out any mention of the crushing sanctions designed to strangle Zimbabwe's economy. Western governments love to talk about respecting property rights. But what about when a whole ownership structure is premised on racism, theft, and colonialism? It's obvious that the real right is African people's right to reclaim ownership over what was always theirs. So let's be clear. This is not about human rights or corruption. Never has been. Whether it's the Berlin Conference, sanctions against Zimbabwe, the war on Libya, or AFRICOM's expansion, it's always been about punishing any African country that defies Western powers.